Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this workshop on the Christmas bird count, how to make your Christmas bird count the best. We're excited to have you here, whether it's your 50th bird count or your first. And I'm joined here today by Jennie MacFarland from Tucson Audubon and Troy Corman from AZFO. And they will be sharing with us some tips and strategies on how to have the best count, make that data the most worthwhile it can be. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jennie and Troy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. As Kirsten said, I'm Jennie MacFarland. I am on staff for Tucson Audubon Society as the bird conservation biologist, but I'm also the recently cycled off vice president of Arizona Field Ornithologists. So I was involved with both organizations and for several years served as vice president until my term limited out. And co-presenting today will be Troy Corman, who is the current president of Arizona Field Ornithologists. Go ahead, Troy, and I'm going to share my screen and I'll start with our AZFO information.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so we're going to be talking about this is a co-presentation of AZFO, Arizona Field Ornithologists, and Tucson Audubon Society, and we're going to be talking about Christmas bird count tips and techniques. But a little bit about AZFO first.
Yes, Arizona Field Ornithologist has been around since about 2005. It seemed odd not to have an organization as birdy as Arizona and didn't have a national or a state organization. So we started that soon after the Arizona Breeding Bird Atlas was finished up, which just to let folks know, as you can see, it's an organization of birders, and even though it has ornithologists in its name, don't scare you away from that. It just means that if you're an ornithologist, you basically like to look at, study birds. You don't have to do it as a profession. So birders fall into that category, and the organization just tries to increase the knowledge of the bird status and identification and distribution in Arizona. Just because that's changing, as you know, constantly changing. The winter status of birds changes, and so does the breeding status changes. So we're just trying to keep up with some of that and get that information out to everyone that's interested in. So yeah, and some of the projects and programs that we do have a website and at AZFO.org. Arizona Birds is our publication. It's an online publication with peer review articles that are in there that you can view. We do have a photo documentation site that's on there. So a lot of the rare birds and things that have been documented in the state with information on their status records is there. We do currently have a sound recording library of birds that were recorded in Arizona. It doesn't have every species, but it's there for viewing. To let folks know, we do have a Gale Monster Research Grant program where we have some funds to provide each year to people doing studies. It could be actually research, grad student projects, or it could be just a general birder that needs some funds for maybe gas to go to an area and do surveys where we don't know the information about. We do have expeditions. We don't have as much in the way of field trips, such as an Audubon Society does. We actually do try to do expeditions around the state. It is a statewide organization, and we usually have a purpose for going to those places to gather a little bit of data, but still have fun and get people together, birders together from around the state. For those folks that are in the counting checklists, county listing, we do kind of keep up a little bit for a lot of the counties. We have what the latest status is, how many species, that kind of thing. And then we also help coordinate the Christmas bird count. Again, as AZFO does, we have several projects that we do annually. And one of the things that we do is help compile the dates and compilers for each of the Christmas bird counts, and gets that information out there and shares it along with Tucson Audubon. And we have other projects, annual surveys that are done, like a winter raptor survey at the Santa Cruz Flats. And then just like this, we do have workshops, maybe for bird ID or for sound information out there. So just watch for those as well, other workshops like this one. So next we've got And one of the things we do have is we do have an annual meeting. We did have, we postponed it a little bit, just like a lot of people did during COVID, but we had our first in-person meeting this year over by Safford. And so we will, we get everybody together, excuse me, we try to get everybody together from around the state to these, so you get to see maybe birders you've heard names of, but never have met them. And we also have just kind of mini expeditions before and after the actual meeting that we have. And just to let folks know, the next, it's usually in the fall, and the next meeting is going to be in the Payson area, so more centrally located in the state.
And they're really fun. The statewide meetings are really fun.
Yeah. So, so we do have, we do have one of the projects we do like expeditions is we have eBird gaps. We kind of, a lot of folks are using eBird, and the state has a lot of open areas that don't get people to visit. And so we kind of look to see where we need information, and we kind of choose a site and provide maps that you can view and get out to those sites, so you can go out and gather data for eBird data where we don't have information for the state. And that helps, it helps generate the national maps of locations and you know, of birds and species. When you have big gaps, that information is not there. So it helps fill in the gaps. And that's why we call it eBird gaps. That's something AZF does. Again, we're trying to gather information where we don't have it. And we're also, we're just to let folks know, our website is going to, we're working on getting that replaced. We're getting a new website. And so hopefully within the next 6 months to a year, we'll have a new website that'll be hopefully fresh and easier to navigate than the old one that we have currently.
Thank you, Troy. I hope that was a nice intro to Arizona Field Ornithologists for everybody, because if you haven't heard of that organization, it really is. It's very fun. It's very cool. And it's for all birders, not just ornithologists. Like, everyone can participate. It's really fun. You learn so much with them too. All right. So we're going to talk about Christmas bird count, tips and techniques, making your annual CBC experience even better, because they're certainly a lot of fun anyway. But these are some strategies for folks who've never done one to feel more confident going in and helping with the CBC, and those who have done them for a long time, maybe learning something new to help you find a few more birds, maybe have a little more fun out there in the field. So we thought it'd be fun to talk about where Christmas bird counts even came from, because they're kind of an interesting thing. Like, why is it so associated with Christmas, and why is it in the winter, which is not normally when big community science bird counts tend to happen? And there's a really interesting history to this. So there's an unexpected origin of the count. So there was this idea of the Christmas side hunt. It was a tradition that happened in, you know, North America, and it was a sort of an activity that some families would do during the Christmas time, during sort of that downtime where people aren't at work and everyone's at home. And it was an outdoor activity where teams would go out. So you sort of split the group of people, family or an estate or just friends or whatever, into teams, into sides. And you would go out and competitively shoot as many things as you could. And so it was like a contest that people would do, like a game, like a Christmas game people would play, go out and shoot everything. So this has obvious issues surrounding it, where you're killing a lot of wildlife. So in 1900, Frank Chapman, who's an ornithologist, suggested a new approach to try to, rather than just sort of admonish everybody, don't kill all these birds and small mammals and other wildlife, why don't we do a Christmas bird census instead? So go out and competitively count birds instead of shooting at them. So this is a reproduction here. There's Frank there at the top. And this is the article he posted in Bird Lore, which was a magazine. It was an early version of the Audubon magazine. And he's just suggesting, let's go out and count birds instead of shooting them. So that's why the Christmas bird count is associated with Christmas and with this time of year, because it was trying to, it successfully did supersede an older tradition of hunting birds. So the Christmas bird count is such an interesting sort of social activity that people do together, and it gets a lot of people involved in birding. Many birders you speak with, and how did you get involved in birding? Many of the things that they'll point to are Christmas bird counts that they did initially. But it also has a huge amount of data. So it is the longest running citizen science survey in the world. And the very first circle, so first we'll explain that later, because Christmas bird counts are always in a circle. you search within a circle, geographic circle. So the very first one was Christmas Day of 1900. So the very first count had 27 participants, and there were 25 locations that all did that count that very first year that Frank had proposed it. So that's pretty, I think that's pretty good for a first try at trying something new. And they did count 18,500 birds, and they got 90 species. So that's pretty fun. So here's just a very brief, truncated summary of counts over the year. So that very first year of 1900, there was 25 locations, 27 people. But then when you go to 2000, the winter, so it straddles the new year. So that's why the seasons are listed this way. So 2000, 2001, 52,000 people, over 52,000 people participated with over 1,800 locations. And then by the year 2012 to 2013, it's over 71,000 people and nearly 2,500 count circles. So that's a pretty big growth, but also pretty good representation on that first year. So it's also, like you said, Christmas bird counts have this huge ability to get people involved and get people interested in birds and birding. And how that's looked over the years has definitely changed. So definitely helps introduce a lot of people to the concept of citizen science and community science. And the fact that 0 is an important number, because if you're doing a count circle and there's a bird that's totally absent that was present in high numbers last year, that's super relevant to getting a picture data-wise of what's going on in the larger area. And the fact that the data that we all go out and collect and have a great time doing it does actually contribute to science and conservation. And they're very social. You do them in teams. And if you're a beginning birder, it's a great way to learn because you tend to be paired with people who have a little more experience, and you can really learn a lot from them throughout the day. And sort of counts have definitely become a lot more diverse, both in terms of ethnicity as well as age. A lot more children now involved. In some areas, we'll even do special sort of children's teams or children's versions of Christmas bird counts in the community. So they've really done a lot to help get people involved in birds and birding and science. So there's a lot to keep in mind if you are joining a Christmas bird count, and the responsibilities can vary. If you're a team leader, you certainly have a little more responsibility of knowing exactly where your assigned area is, because these are a survey. They're super fun, and they're not as sort of rigorous as other surveys can be, but there still are some rules. And one of the biggest rules of a Christmas bird count is that you need to stay inside your area. You don't want to be going into other people's assigned territory within the larger circle and double counting birds. That's definitely one of the biggest things to understand. Now, if you're not a team leader, if you're just joining a team, that's something you have to worry about less. But especially if you're a team leader or you're out there by yourself doing a section of a Christmas bird count, you really want to know where you're supposed to be. So having good maps and copies of those maps is a great idea. Now, there'll be someone who's a count circle leader who's in charge of the whole circle. And it's their responsibility to make sure the team leaders have that information that they need. But that team leader really needs to make sure they read it and look at it before count morning. So definitely want to review your area via Google Earth. If you need to do access details, it's important to do that before the day of if you need to get permission for key areas. This is also something that a circle leader should have a pretty good handle on, because from year to year, most circles, they do keep notes of what happened from year to year, like, oh, this person, this is the phone number I'm supposed to call to get access to that apartment complex or something. So you also want to really look at the habitats on Google Earth if you can, and make sure you're hitting varied habitats throughout your section, and really look for bodies of water and marshes that you can maybe see on a map to make sure that you're not going to miss them. Because I help with the Nogales count every year, and that big Walmart down in Nogales, it's not obvious from the parking lot. There's a huge pond right next to the parking lot, and if you have to kind of stand pressed up against the chain link fence, then you can see well into that pond. And we get really great birds there every year. But if you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know to look there. And there's totally no problem with access, but looking at the Google map ahead of time helps you find those resources within your section. Do you have anything to add about this, Troy?
No, yeah, and that is, just to let folks know that the count circle, if you is basically 15 miles across.
Yeah, so here's some examples.
Yeah, and so these are kind of the examples of how much of an area that they cover, and just from those you can even see that the different habitats that might be in there. These are ones from Arizona. Yeah, so here's like some mountains down here, just the Huachuca Mountains.
and then some flatland, some grassland in this circle. And they're kind of divided out into sections, and each team will be responsible for a section. So, but within your section, you want to make sure you see where the habitats are and looking for these resources. So here's a good example of sort of a section that you and your team might be assigned. So you're like, okay, so here's a trailhead, or we'll hike this trail, we'll get our desert birds, and then we'll got to make sure we hit this marsh and make sure we find a point where we can use our scope to see into this open water body and count the ducks. And then, oh, don't forget that agriculture area, there could get different species out there. So if you're trying to maximize your species count for the day, and most people are during Christmas bird count, want to get as much information as they can and get as many species as they can, as well as high counts. And then urban areas can be very productive as well, or rural or suburban interface. So keeping that in mind, that you want to be looking at these different areas because you're going to get different birds associated with them, is really a key to getting a high species count. And a lot of people do scouting. They go out before Christmas bird count day, because the Christmas bird count all happens on one day, and it'll be an assigned day for each circle. It all happens within 24 hours. So you definitely want to consider scouting. And sometimes circle leaders will do this for multiple locations, multiple sections, or a section leader will do it within an area. But you definitely want to maybe, these are some things, if you're going to scout, you want to keep in mind. See if access has changed, or if you need permission to get into anywhere. This can change over time. Less with Christmas bird counts, but in my experience with the Tucson bird count, a big urban bird count, whole neighborhoods can become gated communities from last year to this year, and now suddenly you don't have access. Things like that can happen. Determine where concentrations of birds are and the best areas to start or end your day. Some people do that, like they strategize, okay, so the first morning hours are super productive and the evening hours are productive, most productive. Where do we want to focus on for those golden hours? And then some people during scouting, they find rare birds that they want to tell others about, to make sure there's a real effort to try to find them on the count day, because finding them on count day makes them count more in the data. And then there's this concept of count week birds. So you'll sometimes hear people mention that, oh, it wasn't on the count, but it was count week. And what they mean by that is that it is a bird that was counted within the circle, seen, documented within the circle, but maybe not on the actual day of the count, but within 3 days before or 3 days after. So literally the week of the count, with the count day being right in the center, 3 days before, 3 days after, if a bird was seen within that time span, but it wasn't on the day of, that can be included in the data as a supplemental bird, called a count week bird. So if you hear people say that, that's what they mean. And it's an important concept, because not just for sort of making yourself feel better that the bird was missed on the count day, but also because it does have important context. So the bird was occurring in that circle, but maybe just for whatever reason. I did help with the Tucson Valley Christmas bird count once, where the weather was terrible the day of the count, really bad, really rainy. It was like a weird fog that descended on Tucson and was there most of the morning. So definitely some species got missed that had been seen during scouting 2 days before the count. So those were included as count week, because it does give important context that they weren't missing, they just weren't detected. So it definitely helps when you're looking at trends and data to do that. So yeah, if poor weather conditions occur, that's pretty helpful to have a count week concept. So definitely want to do this in a team if you can. It's a lot of fun too. It makes the day go a lot more sort of faster. And it also helps new people get interested and involved if your team has some newbies on it. And I mean, most people tend to be on teams of 4 or more. If you have 4 or more, you might want to consider splitting up. That's the main thing here. Often people do Christmas bird counts as a pair, or 2 or 3 people, or even 1 sometimes. But if you have more than 4 and it's difficult for you all to fit into one vehicle, I would definitely suggest splitting up, at least for the morning. You're going to maximize how many birds you're going to get as a team if you can hit some of those birdiest hours and birdiest locations, simultaneously as a split up team. And if you're going to split up, keep that in mind in terms of scopes. If you have a spotting scope among the members of your team, it is a good idea to bring a scope. I know they're kind of heavy, and some people don't like lugging them around, but in the winter especially, you get sort of ducks on a water body in the distance and sparrows sitting on a fence line. And boy, is that what a scope can really be helpful to help you identify those birds. So yeah, lets you cover more areas. And often people will sort of split up. If they're going to split up, they'll split up and then plan to meet at a certain place in time. So like maybe meet at this area at 11 a.m. for lunch or something. That's a great way to sort of come back together as well as discuss what happened. And if species are missed, like if you went to the pond and you were looking for a specific bird and he wasn't there, you can go back. There's nothing, unlike other surveys, we don't want you going to the same places again. You can go back to a site if you're looking for something specific. Just be really careful not to double count birds. You're gonna have to go with your gut on this. But if there was 5 coots there when you were this morning, but your gadwall wasn't there and you need him for the count, and then you go back 2 hours later and the gadwall's there, but now there's 6 coots, maybe leave it at 5, because he may have moved from another part of the count where he was counted. But just go with your best judgment on that, but just be really careful about double counting. And I cannot emphasize this enough. If you're going to split up, definitely swap phone numbers. I feel like people in the excitement sometimes forget that. Boy, is it helpful to have a way to contact people in real time if you can't find them or you're trying to tell them something. You found this amazing bird and you want people to come see it or something. And as a backup, having a set meeting place and time is always a really good idea. Do you want to, is there anything you want to add, Troy?
Yeah, and I think these are just some key things that a lot of people may not know. And I always, when I choose a lunch spot, a lot of times we're eating out in the field, depending where you're at. And so I always, with my team, I usually choose a lunch spot where you have a good view of a lot of things. So while you're eating, you're also birding at the same time. And sometimes you can scan and see raptors that otherwise you didn't see in the sky while you're eating, or something just goes by, so that you may not see the rest of the day. So I usually try to find some spot that either is a really birdie area or at least has a good vantage point.
Oh, it's a fabulous point. And definitely, we're going to mention that raptor thing again in a minute here. And so where to begin in your day? We kind of already covered this, but you definitely want to maybe factor in what you found while scouting. Now, cold Christmas bird counts are happening in the middle of winter, and they can be quite chilly, even in Arizona. So it's a really important thing to keep in mind that birds are also feeling very cold, and they tend to hang out first at that first, early in the morning on the eastern edges of the stands of trees, or even on a big tree on the eastern side of a tree, because they're trying to catch those first rays of sun. So looking there can really be helpful in the early cold hours. And bodies of water will attract birds throughout the day. So you might want to plan on maybe hitting them multiple times to see if anything new has popped up. And then also keep in mind too, this concept of that intro photo we have with all the blackbirds flying. Cattails and bulrush marshes often have huge roosting flocks of blackbirds, and sometimes swallows, sometimes in the winter. You get huge roosting groups of blackbirds. And if you're there at dawn, when they're all lifting off to go feed throughout various areas within or outside of the circle, that can be really helpful to just knock off all the yellow-headed blackbirds and other blackbirds first thing in the morning as they're all coming up as a huge flock of, we did this once for the Tucson Valley CBC, and it was estimated over 40,000 blackbirds leaving a marshy area at that cement plant on the west side of I-10. And that is something too that the count circle leader should be coordinating to be like, okay, this is in your section, this is what I want you to do, that kind of thing. So a lot of this falls under the count circle leader, but just if they're asking you these sorts of things, no, there is a lot of strategy behind it. And if you're going to get swallows in the winter, which does sometimes happen in southern Arizona, you can sometimes get swallows, and most of them have migrated, but you get a few that some winters will overwinter. You're going to be most active over bodies of water within an hour of sunset, so in the evening. So owls and rails. Okay, so if you hear a bird and you can identify it, it does count. You do not have to lay eyes on them to count them for your Christmas bird count. So some people for their section will go out and do some calling, listening and looking for owls before dawn. So this is something too that should be coordinated with the count circle leader to make sure people aren't duplicating efforts or getting up unnecessarily. But there's usually someone whose job it is to get up or camp out even the night before and pre-dawn listen for some of these owl species to get them on the count, to get them on the circle. So you want to keep in mind that, just before sunrise can be one of the best times to listen for owls calling, as well as rails too. So rails from marshy areas, so like Virginia rail calling or Sora calling. pre-dawn can be really very good. Now, elevation can be very important for separating out the small owls. So if you see them, especially the little screech owl. So western, in the southeast corner of the state, western screech owl tends to be below 5,000 feet, whereas whisker is above 5,000 feet. Now, this is only in southeast Arizona, but elevation, these owls look very similar. So elevation can really help with that. Now, they sound quite different. So, but yeah, so if you're hearing them, there shouldn't be an issue. And then northern pygmy owl will actually call throughout the day. So that's a bird that can call during the day. And then great horned owls will often call on their own within an hour before sunrise. And then the rails, the Soaring Virginia rails, will be in those cattails and bulrushes. They may also respond throughout the day. And a trick that people have used for them for a long time is clapping. And if you ever see a birder standing in Sweetwater wetlands or somewhere similar, just start clapping into the rushes, and what are they doing? They're trying to get Sora to respond. That's a long held traditional way of trying to get them to call back. So certainly try it. It's fun. And then if you see others doing it, that's what they're doing. So day roosting owls is another thing to keep in mind. You want to be thinking about areas where you can safely go in and look for owls that are roosting. So old barns, buildings and structures like under bridges, places that do not get hardly any human disturbance, but owls can still get in, is a place where they might be hanging out. So you want to watch for concentrations of whitewash or pellets. So the pellets they regurgitate or they're whitewash. So yeah, definitely under bridges and structures is a good spot. And then isolated trees or stands. So mesquite thickets, those really large tamarisk trees. Sometimes barn owls will be roosting in there. Large mistletoe clumps, hanging broken limbs with dense dry leaf clumps. These are all areas where you might find owls. And boy, those are such a prize to find on a Christmas bird count morning and so fun. Troy, do you have anything to add about these items before we move on to tech?
Yeah, I guess just the only thing was with the owls roosting, when we mentioned large mistletoe clumps and hanging broken limbs with dense dry leaves, they're basically, these are branches that have broken off during the, say, monsoon season and are still hanging in the tree and they haven't dropped their leaves. So it's a nice, dense, brown area that small owls like to roost in sometimes. So, and if they are roosting, they often roost in them day after day, and so you will start seeing the whitewash underneath those little clumps. That's something to watch. I've actually found saw-whet owls that way, and and so you just never know. Just watch for the whitewash down below because that's a regular roosting spot.
Yeah, people I know who find a lot of owls, I ask them what their secret is, and looking for whitewash, so like their literal sort of poops, is one of the most common answers I get. Also, let's cover what these owls are before I move on. This is a barn owl at the top. This middle owl here is a long-eared owl, and then a great horned owl here at the bottom. All right, so smartphones are very helpful in a lot of things. Now they're good too at knowing where you are on your map. That can be one good use for them, but they're also really good for keeping track of your data. If you are someone who uses eBird, using the eBird app is very helpful and can really help you throughout the day doing your Christmas bird count. So if you want to keep a series of eBird checklists, and you don't have to do it as one big checklist, it's actually better for the data if you don't, but doing it as a series of checklists, and then at the end, compiling them into a summary, which the eBird app will let you do, into a summary, and then using that to fill out your Christmas bird count paperwork that you then turn in, is so helpful. And it lets you make sure all your data is going into eBird as well. So it's helping other studies. And it's super user-friendly and constantly improving. So I highly recommend you check out, if you're not familiar with eBird, check out eBird. It's totally free to use. And their online app that lets you do data entry in the field, doing like a checklist in the field, is free as well and very easy to use. You can also get apps on your phone that are for bird identification. So it's kind of like having a field guide in your phone. And Sibley has an excellent one. It is not free though. It does sometimes go on sale, so watch for that. So sometimes like on Migratory Bird Day or something, it'll go on sale. But both Merlin from Cornell and Audubon offer free apps that are very good, that have photos of birds, information, sounds, bird calls. So that's really cool. You can also, another one that's really popular is iBird Pro, which also is one you have to pay for, but very good. And then Xenocanto is a really interesting resource. If you're really into it and you want to know what a specific bird sounds like, you can go to this website called Xenocanto, Xeno with an X, and you will get really good information excuse me, you'll have recordings that you can listen to of birds that people have submitted from all over the world. It's actually really cool. And birders make better ornithologists. So what's really fun is people who go out and bird a lot, or even, get started and, you're thinking about birding, a lot, you really get some really cool techniques. And we're going to talk about some of those right now that really help you find really cool birds. So when you're developing techniques to find unusual birds, you'll do a better job at documenting common ones too. So learning these techniques, even if you're not interested in looking for rare birds, can be really very helpful. So knowing, if you're familiar with your area, especially your region, and knowing what's rare and what isn't in the winter is also pretty darn helpful. So if you know that something like plumeous vireos, Cassin's vireos, and black-throated gray warblers are certainly very possible. They're not abundant, but they're always around in the winter and, in the lower elevations of Arizona. It really helps you know what to look for and what to keep in mind in terms of learning the calls ahead of time or listening to calls, or if you hear a weird call, kind of narrowing it down maybe. And also looking for seasonal rarities can be pretty important too in terms of getting your count up. Do you have anything to add here, Troy?
Just that, yeah, these birds here, sometimes they're a little tricky to identify, especially the difference between Plumeous and Cassin's vireo. And you just never know. Sometimes out of all the teams that are out there, you may have the only area for certain birds to get on a fairly regular basis, and you may only get one or two of them. So your team may be the only one to get one for the entire circle, depending on what the circle is and things. So that's kind of why we're kind of making sure you kind of keep an eye open. And a lot of these birds that mentioned there, the vireos and the black-throated gray warbler, are often mixed in with mixed groups of flocks that are foraging through. And I think the next slide will talk a little bit about that. But that's just something to watch out for. It's like they're not all yellow rump warblers. They're not all, kind of ruby crown kinglets. A lot of things move with these birds.
That's a really good point. We are going to cover that. So before I move on to, because these aren't labeled, this is a black-throated gray warbler here at the top and a mesquite tree. And these are two vireos that look very similar that both can occur in the winter. And so on the left here, we have plumeous vireo, and then on the right, Cassin's vireo with a little bit of that yellow in the flanks. It's yellow wash here. Okay. So there's another thing too. And recognizing habitats, I do have a little handout that I'm going to include in the follow-up email to everybody that has this information. So don't worry about trying to write it down. I do have a really nice one-pager handout with some of these details that I'll make sure gets sent out with the link, the info link. But recognizing habitats when you're out searching around can really help you too. They're not all the same. Some habitats are more likely to have clumps of birds than others. And if an area looks different, if you have clustered vegetation, hedgerows, or clumps of trees, those can be very, very good for checking carefully. Less vegetation, that indicates the presence of water, is going to perhaps have food resources like insects there, so there'll be more birds. Native plants, this cannot be emphasized enough. If you know which trees are native and shrubs and other plants are native versus non-native, the birds are going to more likely be in the native vegetation. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that native plants attract more native insects, therefore, food for the birds. Tall trees, blooming trees. Some of the eucalyptus trees will bloom in southern Arizona this time of year because they think it's spring in Australia. So you get some that bloom in the winter. Hummingbirds really like those. And then open fields, agriculture fields, or open fields can be very good for some raptors or other ground birds. So things like, netleaf hackberry, which is a native acacias and polyverdes. Clustered pines and other conifers, which you tend to find like in the courtyards of apartment complexes. Those can be really good for roosting owls and other birds. Things like the vireos can show up in places like that. Deciduous trees, especially cottonwood and pecans, those get these flocks of warblers that we're going to talk about in a minute. Oaks of any kind, fruiting exotics, so palms, Chinese pistache trees, English ivy, pyracantha. You see those big bushes with the red berries. Pyracantha is a great one to check because you can get mockingbirds, robins, and other sometimes rarities will show up in pyracantha. Things like eucalyptus will bloom. It can bloom, or if they have sap-sepal holes because they're flowing sap. Things like bottle tree, and then some things like the athel salt cedar, which is generally it's not a native, but it does get really thick and clumpy. You can get owls in there, so that's really quite good. But you want to ignore things like oleander, sumac, Chinaberry, and then those non-native acacias and sennas. So again, I have a little handout of this, so I'll share that with everybody. Agriculture lands can be very, very good. You want to check out fallow fields, alfalfa fields, Bermuda grass. So you wouldn't think a turf field would be very good, but that section between Tucson and Phoenix, the Santa Cruz Flats, those turf fields in the winter often get mountain plovers on them. So it's really a very good to check these edges and these like weedy fields where you have tons of, these weeds growing are full of seeds, and you get things like Lawrence's goldfinches or other finches. So taller, weedier field edges or irrigation runoff drains can often have really good concentrations of sparrows and goldfinches, and they're not that pleasing to the human eye, but they're really definitely worth checking. And so foraging flocks is what Troy mentioned. So you get these collections of birds, and this is a phenomenon you can get kind of anytime. But I feel like in southern Arizona you get especially in the winter, where you get these mixed foraging flocks, and by mixed I mean mixed species of passerines, so little songbirds, and you can sometimes get big collections of yellow-rumped warblers that are all kind of moving together and feeding or hanging out in a specific tree feeding. And if you watch and you look carefully, sometimes there's other species present. So when a bird you're the only Townsend's warbler in your area, and most of them, others have left, but you're one hanging out for the winter and you want to feed, you feel less vulnerable if you're with another group of similar birds. So things like, black-throated gray warbler and, overwintering, Wilson's warbler, something will tend to mix in with other more common warblers. So definitely check those flocks, especially if they're all feeding, because that attracts other birds to them. And so you really want to keep this in mind in key areas where there's a lot of cover, multi-structured native vegetation. So especially along like waterways. This is where I tend to see along washes, rivers, waterways, and near some source of water. Even if it's like a small, irrigation runoff at the edge of an ag field with some trees growing around it can sometimes create this effect. And even a single young cottonwood or a willow and a stand of exotic residential plants can harbor rare gems among the more common wintering birds like orange crown warblers and yellow-rumped warblers. Troy, would you like to add anything here?
Nope, I think that covered it. It's just you just never know where these little groups are going to be, and a lot of, like she said, washes and riparian areas are often get the largest groups, and then up into the oaks when you start getting into the foothills.
And they tend to be calling a lot. They tend to be making a lot of little chip and chirp notes. So listening and looking for the movement and listening for them calling can really be a good clue that something's going on that you should be focusing in on. Yeah. So these mixed flocks can compose of many different species. So you frequently have bridled, or if you're further north, Juniper titmice, and then sometimes mountain chickadees up at higher elevations. And then you often get sort of mixed in with these birds, warblers, nuthatches, brown creeper, vireo, kinglets, gnatcatchers, blue-gray gnatcatcher, and little flycatchers will sometimes jump in with these groups. You'll see them hanging out near these groups. So if you hear a lot of activity and you see the first 10 birds you look at are yellow rumps, don't just move on. Spend a few more minutes, because you really could have other things mixed in with those birds. So pishing is another thing that comes in here when you're talking about a flock. Because when people see a mixed flock or they hear a mixed flock, they hear activity going on. More experienced birders will do this thing called pishing. And I think this is worth explaining to beginning birders, because even if they don't feel confident doing it, knowing this will help you understand what the heck this person is doing. So it's boy, this must look unusual to people who are not birders and see someone doing this at the base of a group of trees, like we do during our Nogales Christmas count on the edge of a parking lot of an industrial trucking area, doing pishing, standing at a group of cottonwoods. So the idea here is you're making sounds that simulate agitated birds. Okay, so when birds get agitated and they get angry, often in the presence of like a little owl, they'll make the really agitated sounds, and they sound kind of sounds. And some strategies here is you want to stand still, and you want to, if you can, sort of not draw attention to yourself visually. So sometimes people will sort of stand next to a tree or even behind a tree or something like that, behind a car maybe, and do their pishing sounds. And you want to be also doing owl whistling, or sometimes playing a recording. So sometimes you'll see mob mixes or pishing tapes. If you're not doing this, especially in the winter, you could be missing a lot of birds and species in your area. And it can create amazing activity where you didn't think there was anything there, and then this will pull birds to the forefront of the vegetation you're looking at. And it's pretty amazing. People who are very good at this, it's amazing what they can pull out. And then suddenly there's like birds everywhere that you can look at, and almost too many to look at. It's really a magical thing. And doing it at the edge of promising dense habitat is really one of the best strategies, because even I tend to try to do it in areas where I feel like there's already something going on, like you're hearing a few call notes. But if you're in an area, you have to check, and it's worth doing it maybe for a minute or two, even if you don't see anything, just to see if anything's there. And you can do it loudly at first, and then it's really important to listen too, because if you're making too much noise, you're not going to hear other birds, that are, real birds that are responding. So one good strategy is people will sometimes pish up to a minute with no response, but they keep going for a little bit longer, and then suddenly you'll get birds. So it's not an immediate thing. You can't just pish for a few seconds and expect a response. So using owl sounds is another really important strategy, because that helps the other birds in the area understand what's going on. So there's a little owl calling. It has to be a little owl, one that little birds feel like they can challenge. You're doing the calls of like a Western screech owl, and then you're doing pishing sounds too. So it sounds like there's an owl that called, and other little birds in the area, like yellow-rumped warblers or titmice, are upset, and they're calling and they're pishing at it, or they're making the sounds at it. They're scolding sounds, and it makes other birds curious, and they want to come see what's going on. So that's the basic idea, and here's an example of someone doing it. Can you hear that? So it's a little hard to see, but these little tiny shapes moving around and little birds flying in, and the chickadees are going crazy and making their little agitated sounds. And then the birder here is hooting like an owl, as well as doing sounds, sort of switching between. And that really is how it's done. And it can be surprisingly helpful. And I know you might feel a little silly doing that. So if you're in an area where no one's around, it's a good thing to practice and see if you can get to the point where birds do respond. And I also don't feel discouraged if nothing happens. Some of the best fishers I've ever met, they fish sometimes and nothing happens. So that's just fine. It depends on what mood the birds are into and what's going on. Do you have anything else to say about that before we go on to counting?
Yeah, and you hit most of the key points. It's just, a lot of people said, yeah, fishing doesn't work for me. You just need to keep working on it. And I've found where one day birds are very responsive to fishing, and you go out the next day and they are not responsive whatsoever. And you could be out there exactly the same day, or exactly the same time the next day. So that's something to just don't give up on fishing. And again, the owl calling is what it is it brings in more birds, and the more fussing that goes on, it brings in more birds, because they feel more comfortable. Because if it's a small bird and it's an owl that's larger than them, they feel more confident coming in and making noise if they have a group of them, basically a gang harassing the owl versus just Juby by himself. So it may take a while for those more timid birds to come in.
Yeah, it's definitely worth developing the skill, and it's a heck of a party trick.
Jenny, we did have a question in the chat, which is,
yes.
Is it okay to actually play an owl call to have the same effect?
I mentioned what Troy has to say about this. I think if in the winter, when it's not breeding season, and if you do it very sparingly, along with your fishing, I think it's okay. What do you think, Troy?
Yeah, especially if it's an area that isn't a hot spot where birders are going all the time and doing that, I think. But you do have to realize that, like some of the mountain ranges and stuff, they do have certain canyons and stuff that they don't allow you to do any recording, basically playback recording at all. So just know where you're at. But a lot of the places you're going to be, it's just not a regular place for birders. So, and you got to realize that you're only fussing with these birds for 5-10 minutes out of the whole day. So it's really not a big thing for getting birds upset just for 5 or 10 minutes out of their entire day.
Yeah, I totally agree. So another thing that comes up a lot in a Christmas bird count is very, very large groups of birds. This is less of a thing in the breeding season, but here in the winter during Christmas bird count, in Arizona, we can get these huge collections of birds. And like, I mean, look at this photo. It's like how do you even come up with a number for that? What a huge number of birds. But there are some strategies that you can use to create sort of a really good guess. And that's a really good guess is so much better than sort of not even trying to put a number on it. So boy, isn't this intimidating? Look at all these birds. Now I have to say, we got a lot of this information from initially from the eBird website. They have an excellent section in their help area of the eBird website with diagrams and a lot of these photos we're going to show with really good strategies on how to do this. So if you want more detailed information, definitely check out that help section of the eBird website. But look at these numbers, my goodness. I mean, it doesn't help when they're all the same species and all the same color and they're all flying around or all in a lake together, like these coots in the middle. So that could be very challenging, but just try, honestly, know that if you try your best and you're doing your best guess, that is so valuable to the science of what's going on. So much better than, this is true of any eBird list you do. People who just put an X because they're not sure, they don't feel confident to put a number on it. Saying, I don't know, maybe 1,000 is so much better than an X, because an X can mean 1 or it can mean 1,000,000, you know. So just doing your best guess, and if you're close enough, you know, it's so much more impactful to the data than not trying. So real common strategy people will use is to split up a flock as it's flying. You have to do this, practice really helps with this, but you have to do this really quickly because a flock of birds flying across the sky is going to be gone in a matter of seconds, or, you know, out of sight within a matter of seconds. So doing it by clumps can really help. So people will sort of really quickly, within a matter of a moment, try to decide, okay, you know, this much space in that flock is about 10 birds, and then trying to see how many clusters would be within that flock. Okay, so if this is 10, and I'm going to estimate there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 clusters of 10. That's about 80 birds. That's a really good guess. You know, that's very helpful. That is certainly good enough, because if you're not sure, now sometimes getting a photo means you can be sure, and this is a photo, so we can be sure. So I said, let's say 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Let's say 10 groups of 10. It's about 100 birds. Now, someone who went and counted every single bird in this photo found 118. 100 is a very good guess. That's very close. That certainly gives you a sense of the fact that it's a very large flock of about 100, and it's very good with the data. Now, if you do get a photo, you can't get an exact number. So let's say this group of birds was flying by very quickly, and we couldn't get a photo. Saying about 100 is pretty good. And another thing you want to be aware of, that when you do this with people, when you show birders groups of birds or photos of groups of birds and ask them to estimate, almost always they are way under, and by a lot sometimes. So do not feel like, I'm like, oh, I think maybe 100, but that seems too high. I don't want to say 100. I'm going to say 50. If you think it's 100, it's probably more than that. So do not be afraid to go with that number that you're thinking just because you think it sounds too high. It's probably not.
Jenny, I have a question about this. This is something that comes up a lot for me personally, is what about when you have like a bush that's full of chittering birds, but you can't really get a good visual on how many there are?
Yeah, what I tell people for data collection, because we do a lot of data projects here at Tucson, what I tell people is you just sort of got to go with your best guess, go with your gut. And if you think, gosh, that's got to be more than 10, I'm going to say 20, or I'm going to say 30, that's a good guess. Going with your best judgment in the field. And if you're doing a different, more detailed data collection, more detailed than Christmas bird count, often there's a way to indicate the fact you estimated. What do you think, Troy?
Yeah, and again, this goes back to fishing a little bit too. If you've got birds moving around in the underbrush, the weedy areas, and you know there's lots of sparrows in there. If you fish, a lot of times, just for 5 or 10 seconds, a lot of them will come from the ground and come up and perch, and you can have a much better idea of how many are actually there. So you'll have a better chance to get a little more, you know, a little more confident in your estimate. Just by fishing, it'll pop them up. They may not stay up there very long, but it'll be enough that you can see how many more are out there.
Yeah, it can be very helpful too. So yeah, just going with a guess is really pretty helpful. Now, another thing you want to keep in mind is depth of a flock. And I'm just going to mention this briefly, but birds that are further away will cluster more tightly visually. They're not literally clustered more tightly usually, but they look to you like they're occupying less space. Okay, so this group of gulls right here is 25. This further group that looks about the same amount of space is nearly twice that. And that's just because as they move, they're further away, they're just sort of as a visual plane, they're packing in more tightly in terms of what you can see. So just keep that in mind. If you're looking at a group of birds standing in a field, the ones further away, there's going to be more sort of per visual, almost like square inch than the ones that are closer. And then mixed flocks. So this sounds silly, but, or I mean, it doesn't sound silly. This sounds obvious, but it's really important, I think, to have someone tell you this. And I remember someone explaining this to me in one of my early Christmas bird counts. When you get mixed flocks, so this photo here is the perfect situation where this happens. So this is a cattle feeding area, and you get these mixed flocks of different types of blackbirds and cowbirds hanging out together. What can work really well, because that's a lot of birds packed in there, and they're moving around, and they're walking around, and they're flying around, and they're feeding, is to sort of try to make a guess of how many total birds there are. It's like, okay, I think this is about 5,000 birds, okay, which is really very possible at these feedlot areas. Say, okay, 5,000 birds, and then you just kind of look at them and get a sense of maybe what percentages they are. So it's like, okay, maybe half of them are red-winged blackbirds, maybe 20% are brown-headed cowbirds, 20% brewers, and then the last 10% are yellowhead. And then I see one rare bronze cowbird or something. So go ahead and then just take that roll estimation of 5,000 and then just break it down by those percentages. And you're going to get a really good guess. That is a really good strategy. Does not feel so overwhelmed when you encounter one of these big flocks. Another thing you want to really keep in mind, and we kind of touched on this, is don't assume that in a flock of common winter birds that they're all the same. So look through those white-crowned sparrows, which is a real common wintering species we got, and look for white-throated and golden-crowned, which there could be one in there. There probably isn't, but there could be, and that's how you find them. Shorebird flocks, really look at them and see if there's rarities, and then watch for those rare warblers among the more common yellow rumps or orange-crowned warblers. And then, like Troy mentioned, you really want to be watching the sky. Especially, this is having lunch is a great time. Just take a look up every now and then, especially if you hear things alarm calling. You really want to be looking for raptors in the sky. Because in the winter, this is when you get things like golden eagle flying over. And it can happen anytime, but when you're out all day for a Christmas bird count, that's a really good chance to keep watching the sky and see if you can see any of these raptors like falcons or vultures or ospreys or eagles flying around. This is especially true sort of in open areas, so agriculture lands, grasslands, wetlands, and just really keeping a track of that open sky, because they can be perched out too. You can get raptors perched out in agriculture lands sitting on the irrigation equipment, for instance. And then, how many times have you looked at a soaring raptor and then look with your binoculars at it and you see smaller birds, harassing it, or you've seen squints or something? But definitely keep an eye on the sky. It's really important and can add some of the most fun moments to your Christmas bird count day. Like when I see, a golden eagle on Christmas bird count day, it's so much fun. Like it's super special. And sometimes multiple teams will see the same golden eagle, but that's still really fun. So definitely keep watching the sky. You really want to be ready to document things too. So if you're going to have a rare bird, even sometimes taking a video with your phone can be pretty helpful. Because if you have a bird calling and you can't get it's too far away, but you can capture that call on a video, that can be very helpful. Having a camera of some kind from someone on the team is really a good way to document rare birds if you do find them. Audio recordings can be one of the best ways, and this is really underappreciated by a lot of birders, since so many people are really getting into bird photography now, and that's great, and you can get really good photos of birds to document birds. But a recording of a rare or unusual bird can be sometimes even more helpful in determining what it is and proving that it's that species. Now, some people do travel around with audio equipment. Most people don't. But even if you are encountering something rare, just sort of jumping into action and putting your phone into like a voice memo mode, or just, I struggle with finding that fast enough, I'll literally just take a video like in my photo application on my phone, just start doing a video to record that sound. That can be super helpful. And then people who are leading, people who are also involved in the circle can help you try to identify that later, or it helps if you're hearing this really strange bird, it really helps just take a video and then share it with other people later to see what's going on. Because Christmas bird counts almost always have a social event at the end. The countdown dinner is often a feature of Christmas bird counts. This has changed somewhat due to the pandemic, but many of them are bringing it back, the countdown dinner. And sometimes there are potlucks, sometimes you meet in a restaurant, and that's a great place to walk around to someone who's a local expert and be like, can you listen to this call that I got? What is this? Or is it this? I think I got this rare bird, is it that? So just doing a video can be super effective way to capture that sound you're hearing. All right, so now we're going to talk about, so we're getting to the next section of our talk. We're going to talk about some of the species ID challenges that can occur in Arizona during Christmas bird count time. So here's the first one, Troy.
Okay. Yeah, it used to be when I first came to Arizona, neotropic cormorants were extremely rare. And again, this was like 40 years ago when I first got here. There was hardly any records at all, and there are very few of them, and you weren't even getting them every year. Well, that's not the case anymore. A lot of places, neotrops are now outnumbering double-crested cormorants in places, especially in Maricopa County. And so now a lot of people have some challenges with these, identifying them. Neotropic cormorant is a smaller cormorant. It does, you want to look for that wedge corner of the bill that often shows a kind of a white edge, even in the wintertime. It's not always there. And it tends to be, the bill is a little bit shorter proportion and a long tail. And I'll mention that a little bit more. The double crested, if it has an orange lure, which basically a neotrop, the lure is feathered, so it's always dark. If you see a bright red or orange lure, I should say, it's a bare skin, and so it's always going to be a double-crested cormorant in that respect. The rounded back edge of a bill is something to watch for, but its bill is proportionally a little longer, and also it has a short tail. When I talk about long tail and short tail, this is how I mention to people trying to identify these, especially because you see a lot of these flying over, and what I always tell people, if you see a cormorant flying over and its length of its neck and length of the tail is about even, so basically you've got the same distance on both ends, it's going to be a neotropic cormorant. If your cormorant is shaped more like a flying goose, meaning the tail is smaller proportion than the length of the neck, it's going to be a double crested. So I always look and say, well, even at a distance, you can sometimes see, well, that looks like a goose flying, and then you realize that it's a cormorant. It's going to be a double crested.
Test time.
Yes.
What are these?
So, yeah, what do you see there?
I see cormorants.
Yes. And
so these guys.
Yeah, you can't see the size is a little harder to see here, but you can pretty much see that all the birds on the left, the center and the far left, all about the same size. They've got dark lures. Some of them you can see that white wedge. And so all these, all the ones on the far left and in the center are neotropic cormorants. And then you'll see the one on the right, you'll see the orange lure, and it does have a longer bill. And you can't tell the tail length just based on the way it's perched, but so the one on the far right is your double-crested cormorant. Okay, so sometimes we're not only just identifying things to species, sometimes we do it to subspecies when there's obviously a difference. And when I started birding, these were two separate species, and they lumped them together, and now there's even talk about splitting them up again. So just things to watch out for in the wintertime. Our typical yellow-rumped warbler here is the Audubon's subspecies. It's the one that we have in the West. They're very abundant. They have no eyebrow. They have more of an eye crescent, and the throat patch is more circular, so it doesn't go back underneath the cheek. It doesn't go back. And they typically don't have any yellow. Sometimes they don't have yellow on the throat, but sometimes they do in winter plumage. They often do have some. And then you go look over at the rare myrtle that we get, which is the eastern form. You can see that they have more of a white eyebrow, and then the throat patch goes back underneath what we call the auricular area, that cheek area. It goes back further, and you won't see any yellow there. And the calls are a little different too. If you're really familiar with Audubon's chip, you'll find sometimes I've been out in a flock and all of a sudden I'll hear a chip that doesn't sound quite right. It sounds flatter. And I said, oh, that might be a different warbler. And then I realized, oh, it's just a different subspecies. The myrtle tends to have a little flatter chip. Okay, so now we got gnatcatchers. We do get, in most parts of southern Arizona, we do get blue-gray and black-tailed gnatcatchers, sometimes occurring in the area in the same habitat, but there are some tips in helping identify them. Blue-grays have fairly long bills, and you can see that the primarily white tail of the unfolded tail. During the wintertime, they pretty much have full tails. It's a little harder sometimes when they're molting in the fall. And then you'll see that the tail tip is less graduated. And again, they're pretty much widespread. And a lot of times what I find with blue-gray gnatcatchers is they're going to be in denser, more wooded areas. And a lot of times if in a riparian area, it's going to be a blue-gray. If you're in native riparian habitat, a lot of times it's going to be a blue-gray gnatcatcher. The black-tailed gnatcatcher has a small bill. As you can see, it primarily has black under the folded tail, more so, and so basically just has the white tips along on the tip of the spots on the tip of the tail, and they are the classic desert habitat. Another thing to keep in mind is black-tailed gnatcatchers are territorial. They don't migrate, and so they are territorial throughout the year. And so you will almost always, if you have one black-tailed gnatcatcher, you will always almost have a second. So they stay in pairs throughout the non-breeding season as well, and they protect their area from others. And if you see, again, if you have one calling, you often will have its mate somewhere nearby also eventually call in. And blue-gray gnatcatchers are not that way. A lot of, you may just have one, or if you have 3 or 4 together, like in a mixed flock, they're almost always going to be blue-grays because black-tailed gnatcatchers don't like company as far as basically another territory nearby. They don't like them coming together. And sometimes you'll have them come together briefly when you're fishing or owl calling, they'll come together, but they often will chase each other off.
We're bringing a third gnatcatcher.
Yes, in Southeast Arizona, we have a third gnatcatcher. After 2020, our big drought year, we lost a lot of the black-capped gnatcatchers that we had in Southeast Arizona, but we assume that the population will build back up again. But the black-tailed gnatcatcher or black-capped gnatcatcher in Southeast Arizona, usually in the foothill and denser areas, they have a longer bill. They also have white under the tail, similar to blue-gray, and the tail is very graduated, meaning it's narrow at the base and widens out towards the tip. And they are in that limited habitat. They like the washes, dry washes that have bigger trees, like the washes that are dominated by, hackberry and things like that are coming out of the foothills. And basically, the sound is also very helpful here.
Yeah, so let's play these 3 real quick. So here's black-tailed gnatcatcher, and these are all recordings that were done in Arizona. Desert one, black-tailed.
Yeah, and you can see it's very kind of
nasal
puffy sounding.
There's blue-gray. A little squeaky. I got all these from Xenocanto. This is the thing you can do at Xenocanto is download audio files and keep them. So that's definitely another little advertisement for Xenocanto. Now, black-capped gnatcatcher especially has a really strange call. So go ahead and listen to this. That's pretty diagnostic. If you hear that, definitely look for that bird. It could well be a black-capped gnatcatcher here in Southeast Arizona. If you're in the right habitat, and it's that little sliding zing, zing kind of
Yeah,
call.
yeah, a little mewing. And actually, if you're from Southern California, it reminds me of the California gnatcatcher.
All right, so moving on here. Now we're on to some raptors. This is one I get probably the most questions about, is how to tell these two birds apart.
Yeah, and it's something that it's always going to be a challenge, and it's always, and for eBird, a accipiter species is good to leave things if you're not sure which one it is. Some of the basic things, if you get good views or even a photograph, you can get a quick photograph even of a flying bird. Sometimes that helps. You have more time to study it. Sharp shins, again, a lot of times will have a square tail at the end. They tend to have more of a little head and no neck look, and that's how a lot of people that are sitting at raptor overlooks when they're counting raptors going over, they kind of look for that. And then the Cooper's hawk tends to have a rounded tail, well, actually a square tail or even basically a notched tail. And then the Cooper's hawk tends to have a more rounded tail, and their head is more extended out, so they tend to have more of a neck look to them.
Okay, and then we have them perched, because this is the second question I was getting. What if they're perched?
Yes. And here you want to look at, again, you can see that a sharp shin often has no neck. The black goes down into the back of the neck. It's connected versus the top of the cap is there's more of a cap look to a Cooper's hawk. These are adults. Again, these are the adults. You can see the smaller bill and a sharp shin, and then the more hefty bill and heftier neck on the Coopers. And then you can also look at the legs. If you get a good look at the legs, sharp shin has very skinny, basically they're little toothpick legs and feet versus the heftier, thicker legs on a Cooper's hawk. And again, if you can get a quick photograph, sometimes you can see that you may not notice in the field. And so it's again, sometimes you don't get a good enough look. And you can always leave them as a accipiter species. That's a perfectly way to leave them. And there is that category when you're doing Christmas counts, and even eBird has that option as well.
Yeah, another thing to keep in mind with these two raptors is in Arizona, in most places, you're not going to get sharp-shinned hawk in the spring and summer. They tend to be a wintering bird. So if you're in an area that you're used to birding outside of winter, a place you usually, are looking at birds more in spring and summer, and you're like, oh, this is always a Cooper's hawk. If it's winter, keep in mind there could be sharp shin around when they're not normally there. Is that right, Troy?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, we do have sharp shins that breed in Arizona at higher elevations, even in Southeast Arizona, but they're pretty local. Even in the mountains of Southeast Arizona, you don't see them very often, but they do occur. They're very sparse breeders in Southeast Arizona, but in lowlands, type areas and lower elevations, you typically only get as a breeder just the Cooper's hawk, and throughout Tucson, the only breeding accipiter is the Cooper's hawk at that elevation.
But in the winter, the little people call them sharpies, little sharp show up, and so definitely keep that in mind if you're not used to seeing them around. And it's fun. I love encountering my first sharp shin of the winter, although that happened to me last week. Okay, so I think that is it. So yes, we are available for questions. Let me open the chat. Let me also stop sharing my screen. Let's see, there is chat. It's hard for me to see it though when I have the screen sharing. Now I can see them. Okay. Oh yeah, someone mentioned the Count Circle app, and then we did have a slide on that we took out at the last minute. But yes, that is an app you can get. It does have a fee associated with it. And there's a person saying, Mike's here saying $2.99. I think that's right. And once you have it, you can use it forever, and you can see the circle on a Google map, your circle or any circle. So that is a pretty cool app. And someone asked about playback. We already answered that. Yes, eBird trip reports. That's a really good point too from Ash. So keeping eBird lists throughout the day is really helpful for others who use eBird data. But it also means you can then generate these really cool reports. You can do a day summary. You can also do a trip report. And if you haven't checked those out before, I highly suggest you look at them. They're really very cool. And that's a series of lists into one summary for the next question here. Okay. is playing an owl instead of fishing okay for a bird count? Yeah, so Troy addressed it. Some areas don't allow it, so don't do it. If it's not allowed, do not do it. But outside of breeding season and doing it for just a few minutes to help you with your fishing, so you're making the fishing sounds, and then the owl is recording as providing the owl part. Yeah, I think that's okay as long as you keep it sort of limited and in areas that don't get a huge amount of birder traffic, and not in areas where it's just prohibited. Yeah, so Troy did mention this. Can you put something in there as a family without IDing a specific species? Yes, you certainly can. So Accipiter is the family that Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks are a part of. You can do that. Christmas bird count data sheets do accommodate that, just like eBird accommodates it. And if you're not sure on the species, just go with whatever you are sure of. You know, you can go higher than that to a group of birds.
Yeah, and another thing you can do is, this is where if you take a photograph, you could, might have enough details in there that someone else could identify it for you later on.
Yes, very good point. All right, do we have, what do you think, Kristen? Do we have time for more questions or?
Yeah, I think so. It looks like we answered all the ones in the chat. So if anyone has any other questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself or, okay, so a question about the recording, whether it'll be available. Yes, we're gonna put this on YouTube and I'll share the YouTube link with everyone who registers, everyone who's on this call. So you will be able to go back and review.
And I have some handouts I'm going to include that I'll send to Kirsten to send out to everybody. And then we have one last question here that's really very good. And I'm wondering what Troy thinks about this. Is Merlin sound ID acceptable for counts? To identify a bird for you using sound? What do you think, Troy?
Just also being an eBird reviewer for Arizona, for parts of Arizona, we're finding that Merlin is not, it's not an end game here. It's not perfect, and we're finding more and more issues with, especially if it's a rare species, it calling out something that's rare when it's when you actually get the recording. You find out that no, it's more common species, and so eBird can call out, especially if it's just giving a call versus a song. And so yeah, don't put something down just because Merlin said it was out there and you didn't see or hear it yourself. Don't put it down. Don't identify it just by Merlin. It's kind of one thing we always say. If you put in your eBird checklist as far as the documentation just saying it was ID'd by Merlin, that's not going to cut it if it needs more detail.
Yeah. The other thing I want to mention before we leave is Troy and I are both offering a field trip tomorrow for those who want to go out in the field and sort of practice some of these techniques we talked about. They're both tomorrow morning at 7:30. Mine, so Saturday, tomorrow morning. Mine will be at the historic Canoa Ranch down in Green Valley, and Troy's will be at the how do you say it, Troy?
The Neenam Mason Pulliam Audubon Center down off of Central Avenue.
In
there.
Phoenix.
Yeah, in Phoenix, the Audubon Center.
So we'll put the links to sign up for those trips in that follow-up email as well. They were in that email sharing the Zoom link with you also. So if you're interested, please go ahead and sign up for one of those two trips. And if anyone comes, we'll see you in the morning.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. This was so super helpful. And thank you everyone for joining us and for your interest in volunteering for the CBCs. We hope that you will do that, and we hope that it's fun and successful and you come back next year. So have fun counting birds. Hope to see you all again soon. Thanks again.
Thanks,
Yes.
everyone.
Yes,
Bye.
thank you. Hope to see you in the field.